Okay, Michael Caputo and his attorney have just finished speaking to the House Intelligence Committee.
Okay, so we went a little bit longer than we had anticipated.
Michael Caputo was a former Trump campaign advisor. Let's go
advised by staff that would be 2 hours or less, but as you can see, we went closer to 3.5 hours, despite the fact that there was some repetitiveness to the questions. I think that Mr. Caputo gave truthful and honest answers to all of their questions. Sometimes the follow-up questions were repetitive in nature, but I think that he delivered what the committee was looking for today, a fair accounting of his time with the campaign. The takeaway here is that he had no Russian contacts during the course of his involvement in the campaign. I think interestingly, he says that he told, I believe, Congressman Schiff that he hasn't had any Russian income, Russian contracts, Russian business for several years. He saw no Russian foreign agents at Trump Towers, and his role in the campaign was limited to sort of a militaristic command structure where he reported up the chain of command through Corey Lewandowski and ultimately to Paul Manafort. Any questions?
Can we talk to Mr. Caputo? Or?
Sure.
Militaristic command structure is not how most people have described the Trump campaign, especially early on. Was part of the defense of this Donald Trump Jr. meeting has been that they didn't really know what they were doing? And was this a sophisticated operation when you were there? Were they these people who knew what they were getting themselves into, in your view?
Donald Trump, when he decided to run for president, when he was talking about just running for president, told me that he was going to do it totally differently. I could go into chapter and verse on that, but you saw it during the campaign season. During the primary, it was basically an events-oriented organization. There wasn't a communications department to speak of. There wasn't an opposition research department at all. Policy, etc., wasn't around. That had to be really difficult for the campaign, for Mr. Trump, and for anyone covering them. But it was very successful. And while, you might say that it was different or disorganized or whatever, and it was very difficult at times, it was also very successful. So he may have rewritten the way we do campaigns, and that may be difficult to understand, but as they went forward, it got more professional. When Paul Manafort came in, I believe he changed it into a real campaign. And when Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway took it over, they brought the football home. So no matter how bad it was or how rough it ran, it was successful. And if you ask me, the way we run campaigns could stand some change.
Can I follow up on that?
Certainly.
In your view, you said it became more professional when Manafort got there. Would a meeting like the one that has been described between Donald Trump Jr. and Manafort and Jared Kushner with this Russian lawyer, could a meeting like that have happened without Donald Trump knowing about it at some point?
I'm satisfied with what Donald Trump Jr. said on television after this thing broke, and then broke again, and then broke again. He says that he would do things differently, and I have to believe in him, and I agree. I admire the fact that he was so transparent and authentic in that interview that I saw on television. I don't know anything about that meeting. I was in Cleveland when it happened. I can tell you that there was more offered opposition research at the Trump campaign than I've ever seen in my 30 years in elections. There was a steady flow of people offering dog-eared files, usually little old ladies in the Trump Tower lobby. That flow was at times overwhelming, and most campaigns would give that to their opposition research to vet. We didn't have that. So, I can see how this can happen.
Congresswoman, statement really indicated that your recent contacts with Russians are very, very limited, and yet you were in there for almost 3.5 hours. What caused it to go on for so long? What were they asking you about for such a long period of time?
Well, there was a lot of redundancy in the questions. I think that they weren't concerned about the length of time. There was a little bit of a disagreement between the two sides about how much time was being spent. But I came here to set the record straight, and I think I did so.
Can you talk a little bit more about the nature of contact with Russians, or the Trump campaign had no contact
Can you
with
repeat
Russians?
that? I didn't hear the beginning.
I'm sorry. Did you testify today that you had no contact with Russians during the campaign and the Trump campaign officials had no contact with Russians?
Today, I spent my time in front of the committee detailing the fact that I had no contact with Russians, that I never heard of anyone in the Trump campaign talking with Russians, that I never was asked questions about my time in Russia, that I never even spoke to anybody about Russia. I never heard the word Russia, and we did not use Russian dressing. There was absolutely no discussion of Russia on the Trump campaign to the day I left.
Congresswoman Spears described you as Vladimir Putin's image consultant. I know that angered you.
Yes.
Respond to that description of your work in Russia.
There was no way I was Vladimir Putin's image consultant. You have to be very naive and uninformed or have a team of really bad interns to come up with that kind of analysis. If you read anything I've written about Putin, heard anything I've ever said about Russia since I left in 2000, you'd know that I'm not Vladimir Putin's image consultant. But you know, I discussed it with the committee. I laid that out there. I'm still very offended by Representative Jackie Spear bringing my wife into this. The day that she did that, on March 20th, I was on business travel. And as soon as she did it in front of millions of people watching on television, we started getting threats over my phone. One person twice called and told me he was going to burn my house down with my wife and children inside. Loose, irresponsible rhetoric is getting people killed. We know it. I don't want my family to be the next one that gets shot. This thing has to end. And more than anything else, the rhetoric has to tone down. And Representative Jackie Spear should be absolutely ashamed of herself.
Did she apologize?
Representative Jackie Spear wasn't there. I'm not quite sure where she is. She's never responded to any of my communications. I expect an apology. I don't believe she'll ever give me one.
When was the last time that you heard or had any contact with President Trump? And do you expect any follow-up questions from this committee or to testify in the Senate side?
The last time I had personal contact with President Trump was in passing during the inauguration. I've intentionally stayed out of the hair of the White House and the administration, especially since my name was brought up in the context of the Russia investigation. Nobody in the administration or the White House needs my telephone number on their call list, needs me on their visitor logs, or needs emails from me. As soon as this is over, I'd like to get back in touch with the administration and the White House, but for God's sake, you guys got to end this stuff.
Sir, you mentioned this flow of opposition research that was coming into the campaign. To the best of your knowledge, was any of that from any foreign entities, governments?
Yeah, all the calls I got were from crazy old ladies and people that were emailing me because they had some kind of crazy thing about Hillary Clinton. That is standard stuff. It's usually dog-eared files, scrawled handwriting. That's the kind of stuff I got. That's the kind of stuff that most people got. But it came in daily. So I can understand how somebody might fall into a trap like this one.
Can you talk a little bit more about the line of questioning that they were giving, and what were they repeating over and over?
Well, you know,
were they going into?
Perhaps you can take
Yeah,
that.
so at some level, this devolved into fishing expedition. You know, it was just a litany of names. And sometimes there was multiple questioners asking about the same individuals. So it was clear, while some of the questions were directed at his time in the campaign and his time in Russia back in the 90s, there were an awful lot of questions that, in my view, I spent 20 years as a prosecutor, so I know a fishing expedition when I see one. I think that many of the questions that were asked were part of the fishing expedition. And that's what got somewhat aggravating, because we were now beyond the relevant aspect of his testimony, of his knowledge, and that's, I think, indicative of the fact that at some level this is a fishing expedition.
Sir, do you expect to testify in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee as well if they ask you to come forward?
Well, so we are, if you don't mind.
Please.
So we are right now in communications with staff counsel. They have asked for information, again, voluntarily asked us, they've asked us to voluntarily turn over information. We're in communication with them right now, so I can't predict whether or not we'll be back here for similar testimony, but we will continue our dialogue with the staff in terms of the documents and information that they're seeking.
Have you spoken with anybody at the FBI or the special counsel's team?
No, I have not, but I'll tell you, if anybody calls me, I'm going to answer, and I'll do whatever it takes to help them clear up this Russian collusion delusion. I'm happy to participate in any investigation.
What kind of documents are being asked for?
Well, principally emails. The request that was made by this committee back in May was not as defined as the request that's now being made by the Senate committee. Frankly, the Senate committee's request is rather broad and expansive in terms of time and a subject matter. So that's what we're negotiating right now. Some limitation, at least, in terms of the breadth of the request. But I want to stress that in both instances, subpoenas are not involved, or were not involved, and we've provided information to this committee voluntarily. We anticipate to do the same with the Senate committee. And if we need to supplement our prior production to this committee, we will do so.
Were there any names or figures brought up?
So there you have it. Michael Caputo, a former Trump campaign advisor, and his lawyer there talking to reporters, summing up his testimony to the House Intelligence Committee earlier today, a testimony that he described as a fishing expedition. He also lashed out at Congresswoman Jackie Speer, Democrat from California. You might have seen him talking about that during those remarks there. She was referring to, and his response to her was a reference that she had made to what she called a tarantula web of links to Russia that she said Caputo was involved in. And Caputo lashed out at Speer about comments about his wife. That was in reference to Congresswoman Speer talking about how Caputo was married to a Russian woman. Just want to get your quick take on what we just heard there from Michael Caputo. He was very impassioned about it, said that he had no contacts with the Russians, that he didn't even use Russian dressing.
Right, so the real question is whether or not other members of the Trump circle, including ones that are much closer in, like Don Jr., can say the same thing. So the fact that more and more campaign staffers are going to be appearing before these committees, it's a crime to lie to Congress in a congressional investigation. So what matters maybe is not what Caputo has to say, but what everybody else has to say, specifically the people who were in that meeting in Trump Tower on June 9th.
And David Chalian, let's get back to the revelations that came out today. Now we have 8 people who were involved in this meeting, according to our reporting here at CNN. The story, as Jim Sciutto was saying earlier, has changed multiple times. We're now in the 5th incarnation of the story. How damaging is this for the White House?
Well, that's why I was so surprised that Michael Caputo just went on to praise Donald Trump Jr.'s transparency. The transparency is out the window. I know that's what his father was praising as well, and that was the line there. But obviously, these revelations that we're learning mean that a 4th or 5th version of events now needs to be proffered from Donald Trump Jr. because what has been on the record from him no longer matches the facts as we understand them. So I think that is the crux of the problem right now. It is a credibility problem. And that's why there are all these lingering questions. As we learn more people that were in the meeting, we are asking again and again, well, what was the actual content of the meeting?
And Mark Preston, why is it that the White House can't get a handle on this? You talk to people at the White House and the administration. Right. Why can't they get a handle on this story?
Well, from our reporting is that they did try to get a handle on it in late June and try to pull some strategy together. Now, we don't know why that strategy wasn't put into motion, or if this was their strategy, why did they decide on this course of action? The bottom line is that this is a very complicated case. It has a lot of legal pitfalls that will now involve White House staffers, we believe, at this point. There were some firewalls that were trying to be erected that would protect some of these staffers, but apparently those firewalls have not worked. The bottom line is what I think happened, and we'll see if this is true, is that there was an incredible amount of hubris from the Trump campaign, from President Trump himself, and he's very much of the mindset, do as I say, not as I do. Trust me what I say. Believe me. And I think that's what happened.
Okay, well, we'll stop right there. We'll get back to that in just a few moments.